House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is calling for sanctions against a Democrat member of Congress for what he says was an incitement of violence during a protest over the weekend in Minnesota. Representative Maxine of California joined a protest in Minneapolis.
We have to let people know that we're not going to be satisfied unless we get justice in these cases.
The 82-year-old Democrat told protesters to ignore an 11 p.m. curfew and, quote, stay in the street. She made other comments that Republicans say were an incitement to violence. Representative Waters says that she was speaking truth to power. And joining us now is Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director at the Daily Caller. Vince, welcome back. Always so great to speak with you. We have a lot to get to, but I want to start off with Representative Maxine Waters. What did you think of her actions over the weekend in Minnesota and what she said, Vince?
Well, the most obvious comparison to think about is the one that came to us earlier this year. You had Democrats accusing the former president of the United States of inciting the violence that we saw take place on the Capitol Hill on January 6th. You'll note in the speech that he gave on January 6th, he urged his supporters to make their voices heard peacefully. That was one of the phrases he used during that speech. A little hard to say that that particular phrase was incitement, whatever you think of the president's remarks leading up to January 6th. As far as Maxine Waters goes, she was very explicit that she wanted her supporters, she wanted activists across the country to be involved in confronting people. She wanted them to continue to be confrontational. And what does confrontational look like? Well, look no further than what we saw this past weekend and certainly in many weeks over the course of the past year among Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists, as in Portland, for example, a Apple store was set on fire. You had gunshots directed at National Guardsmen over the weekend, and any number of acts of violence and destruction over the weekend that were associated with the very activism, rioting, that you've got Maxine Waters out there supporting. So the comparison here, I think, is really obvious. It's that she holds one standard for Republicans and quite another standard for herself. She had accused President Trump of fomenting a civil war for the events that occurred on January 6th. What is she fomenting would be the question for her today.
Yeah, and this isn't the first time that Maxine Waters has maybe so-called stirred the pot. Back in 2018, she told supporters if they saw anyone from Trump's administration, quote, you create a crowd and you push back on them. That said, do you think now disciplinary action should be taken against her? And Vince, what do you think should happen?
She should be held to the same standard that Democrats would hold Republicans to, although as a matter of whether or not that occurs, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen at all. Nancy Pelosi today suggested that she didn't think that Maxine Waters had done anything in terms of inciting or encouraging violence. So they're letting this pass, and it looks like that's the direction it's going to go. But you're right. You've had Maxine Waters in the past tell people to get into the faces of her political opponents and tell them they're not welcome. That's not political debate. That's encouraging your supporters to intimidate your political opponents and to make it so that there is no debate and rather that they're out of the debate entirely. It's pretty remarkable where we've gone politically.
Yeah, I want to switch gears now just a little bit. Over the weekend, President Biden made reference to a, quote, crisis at the U.S. border, and then he seemed to back away from the word crisis today. What do you make of that, and also his reversal on the refugee cap?
Well, there's a couple things at play here. One of them is I'm not sure who's in charge of the United States of America, because typically when the president of the United States makes a statement, that is the binding position of his administration. That's the position that they take. So everyone on down from the president would then come out and say, OK, look, this is the position of this president, the man who was elected by the American people. But what was strange about all of this is that you had President Biden indicate on Saturday that he thought that what was going on the border was a crisis. And now today, the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, came out and claimed, no, that is not the administration's position, and that it was the press who misunderstood the president when he said that. They're trying to make it seem like the border itself is not a crisis, but that the causes of the border crisis are a crisis. This reminds me of earlier this year during an interview with CBS. It was during the Super Bowl. Joe Biden had indicated that one of the preconditions for sitting down with Iran to discuss the nuclear deal would be that they cease enriching uranium. He was asked by Margaret Brennan whether or not that was a requirement. He nodded yes during that interview. That very next day at the White House press briefing, Jen Psaki said that the president's nodding was not an indication of the administration's policies. So I'm a little confused about who's in charge if the president's own words and gestures mean nothing.
Well, Vince, so much more we can talk about. Unfortunately, we have to leave it right there. Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director at The Daily Caller. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy.